All right, there is a book that's the rest of the weeks. There's a week one book and then a rest of the week's book. And so first we started talking about parenting. What was the first week? I lost my mind.
Parenting with purpose.
Purpose. Then we did parenting with prayer. Last 2 weeks ago, we did parenting with priority. And that's basically just living your life with the thought that your children are your priority, and parenting is the job for which you've been called for this season, and God will equip you. And I told this little story about our Christmas tree and what I thought, and it reminded me of John 15. And the one thing I didn't say, because we went ahead and ended, was in John 15:11, after God has given his word about the vine and the branches, it says, so this is Jesus speaking, I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. So much of what the Lord has given us in his word is so that we can have joy. And sometimes parenting just gets so overwhelming we lose that. And that's why we name this class Parenting with Joy, because we know life is hard and sometimes you lose the joy, but we're going to talk about that again in a little minute.
Don't forget the long haul part, though.
Right.
Because it's really lifelong. You
Right.
don't stop being a parent when they turn 18.
And it's interesting, we have a friend who has a grown child. She doesn't come to church here, but she always listens to our classes. And she emailed me the other day and said, you could really just tweak this a little bit and say living life with joy for the long haul. And so if I thought that was sweet for her to say that, but also these are all parenting applications, but certainly just life applications. So we talked a little bit about seek ye first the kingdom of God. When you are giving your children priority, that should be your first priority. And to do that, we just need to stay authentic, connected, like the vine and the branches, fed, disciplined, discipled, fruitful, and living. A couple of things we didn't mention, and I just wanted to touch upon regarding keeping your children as a priority. Our girls are now in their 20s. Well, I think Rachel turned 30, so they're older, they're grown, 2 are married. And how do you maintain that connection once they're out of your house, whether it's to go to college, to just move away, to begin working, and to get married? And we have 3 girls, so when they went to college, we worried about them. We wanted to make sure we knew where they were, and they were in, and they were safe, but they don't want to know that you're worried about them like that, because then they will ignore you. So we just started texting, "Good night, I love you." And if they'd been kidnapped and somebody had their phone and somebody replied, we wouldn't have known. But we just started doing that when Rachel went to college. "Good night, love you, are you okay? Or are you in?" And if they weren't in, we'd say, "Well, let us know when you're in." And so we still do that, and they're married. Rachel's been married almost 9 years, and every night we text her "Good night, love you." And we maybe haven't talked for days, and we do it for Carrie too. And so that is just a way to cover multiple bases. You stay connected, you check on them. They know, even if you haven't talked for a few days, that you're still in their, they're in your hearts and minds, and you love them.
There's never any few days we don't talk with them, though. I mean, we talk to them every day.
No,
We talk to
some.
all 3 of them every day.
There's
One
some
way or
days
another.
Carrie,
Well,
yeah.
we text, but, we have
Anyway,
communication with them all the time.
so just to let them know they are still your priority wherever they are in their life. So that's really it. You were going to talk about the girls going to a school nearby.
Yes, I wrote that down. So this really doesn't have anything to do with what we're going to talk about today, but I want to add something to that. Rachel's our oldest, and my assumption, I went away to school. And my assumption was always that our kids could go away to school if they wanted to. And Rachel initially wanted to go to Indiana Wesleyan University, which is up near Indianapolis, which was fine. But circumstances didn't work out. We don't think it was the Lord's will for her to ultimately end up there. She ended up going to UK. Carrie ended up going to UK. And Anna ended up going to Georgetown. And it's not because we put any pressure on them or anything to do that. It's just the way it happened. But looking back now as a father, I am eternally grateful that they all stayed within 30 minutes of where we were. And I'll tell you a very quick story. I don't know if I shared this with you before or not, but I saw on Facebook several years ago that a friend of mine, his daughter had gotten engaged. And I saw him the next weekend, and I said, hey, I saw your daughter got engaged. What do you think of the guy? And he looked at me, and he said, Armando, I don't know him. And I thought, it just deflated me, you know. And this daughter went to school 4.5 hours away. And he hadn't met, I guess he had met him, but he didn't know him, you know. And so I'm not going to tell you that your kids should not go away to college. You all need to decide that for yourselves. But what I'll tell you is this, having them nearby, particularly because it was a decision they made rather than we forcing it on them, helped us to stay connected with them, to continue to go to concerts. You know, Carrie and Rachel were both music ed majors, so we'd go to concerts. Anna played basketball. We'd go to basketball games. We were always available and involved in the stuff they were doing, which meant we knew who their friends were, which meant we could hold them accountable, but also have an impact or an influence on their friends, you know, so, some of whom weren't believers. So it really has been a grace in our lives that they stayed nearby. And I'm throwing that out so you all will consider it. I think there's a blessing in that. Anything else you want to throw out?
Well, and if they don't go nearby, you've got to make that intentionality to just even stay more connected.
The road goes both ways.
Yeah.
You can't expect them to always be the one to come to you. You can't expect them to always be the one to call you or text you. It's got to be reciprocal. Caitlin Pinkston's parents are here today. I'll call you out. They drove from Kansas to spend a weekend here. That's what I'm talking about. You know, it would appear to me that the expectation is not that Ben and Caitlin will always go to Kansas to see you. And I think that's good. That's the way it ought to be. You know, now they should sometimes, but not all the time. So glad to have you guys. Okay, anything else? Okay, let's go on with today. We're talking about parenting alongside personality. And so one of the things you just caught a moment ago is that Rachel and Carrie were both music majors, and Anna played basketball. So what that might indicate to you is that they had different interests, different approaches to life, different perspectives on life. And so when we talk about personality, we all recognize that each of our children, you know, we often say it's amazing how different children who are raised in the same home can be. Because you raise them the same way, but they have different personalities, different bents, if you will, different interests, different everything. And so this whole notion of parenting with personality is critical because you've got to understand your each child's personality in order to parent them effectively. Okay, so the verse that everybody points to about raising children is Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go or she should go, and when he or she is old, they will not depart from it. And so that's it's kind of thrown in there in Proverbs 22. There's a bunch of verses before it and after it. And if you look at the context, at least in my view, it's kind of like, why is that verse there in the midst of all this other life advice? And different folks have interpreted that verse in different ways. Some interpret it as sort of a guarantee that if you teach your children the way they should go, they won't depart from it. So some people might interpret that as a promise. Other people might interpret it as a warning. If you don't train your child in the way he should go, they'll depart from it, right? And other people see it in the sense of the bent. Train up a child in the way that he or she is leaning. You know, do they have an interest in basketball or do they have an interest in music? And when they're old, they'll stay with it. My approach to that would be that it's all three. That it's a promise, it's a warning, and it's advice. And so as parents, we need to be really sensitive to the spiritual aspects of raising our children, but also to their personality and the things they're interested in and the things that work or don't work with them. So everybody's unique. You know that. Your children are unique. How many of you would say that your children are the same? That your children don't have different personalities? They may have some similar traits or whatever, but so we need to be sensitive to their talents, their personality, their gifts. How are they gifted? To their looks, their appearance. One child might be, quote, unquote, better looking than another. How do you deal with that as a parent, right? their specific tone, how do they respond to you versus the other one? So one might be a little sassier than the other one. How do you deal with that? And then let's say to their failures and their inadequacies. So some kids are going to do some things better than others, and how do you approach that? Some things are going to respond to you better than the other one. Some kids are going to respond better than the other one. How do you approach that? You also need to be aware of birth order and how birth order affects the way they are growing up. So we talk about a lot of times about the oldest one being a type A. That's a real thing, I can tell you.
But we have an oldest who's not a type A.
That's true. So Rachel, who's our
Our
oldest,
youngest is our type A.
Marcia has said Rachel would have died in a fire putting on her socks if there had been a fire, and because she's as low key and easygoing as they come. So, you know, the birth order thing, I think the birth order thing is real, but it also changes from one family to another. So you just have to be aware of it.
The other thing about birth order, and we mentioned this last time, we've got 3 children, so I guess it depends on how many children you have. But when your oldest child is growing up, you have disciplined that child. So she's been disciplined when she's 3, 4, whatever the age adequate discipline is. At some point, she's done with that form of discipline. But then you've got the second one coming up who's coming through those disciplining years. So she's whatever you discipline at 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. Then you've got this baby. So the oldest one's already been through this discipline. The little baby isn't there yet. So you've got this middle child who it would appear you're harping on all the time, because that's just where that child is in life as far as where you need to discipline them or where you need to train them. And so you've got to kind of point that out, because it's not like the baby is special or the oldest one is special. It's just that's where they are in life. And so they're probably too young to really get it, but we did. I mean, we had 3, and they were spaced out enough that was the case, that little Anna wasn't just this spoiled little baby, and Rachel wasn't this golden child, and Carrie was like this horror. Have to also keep in mind personality, whether somebody's laid back or you have to be on them all the time. But those are really things to be aware of. But talk them through with your children. Explain, we're not just being mean to you. There's a reason that you can't do this, or you need to do this, or you should have done that. Rachel went through it, and Anna's going to go through it.
So the standard for discipline and the mechanism for discipline changes at different stages in their lives. So that leads into my next point, which is sibling rivalry. So you probably had your kids just butt heads, and I will tell you that the butting heads of children is probably, for me anyway, has probably been the most frustrating thing about parenting, because I remember the day, it was not good. They were arguing over who was going to get to wear a pair of Crocs to school, a pair of Crocs. We had one pair of Crocs that they kind of shared, and who was going to get to wear them, and they were fighting about it. And I was like, well, you could wear it today, the other one could wear it tomorrow. It's okay, as an adult, it's not a big deal. But to them, it was huge. And it led me to the point of frustration, extreme frustration. Anyway, you have to be aware that sibling rivalry is going to happen, and you have to be careful to navigate that very judiciously, very carefully. It's kind of like a tightrope. Because as Marcia said, you don't want the one thinking that you're always favoring the other one, and vice versa. And we've noticed that there's a tendency sometimes among parents to feel like maybe feel is the wrong word, to favor one over the other, going back to the personality thing and all those things I just mentioned, because of the way that they respond to you as a parent. They might also respond better to the dad than they do to the mom. So all these things come into play, and as a parent, you've got to navigate that and pray about it and try to figure out how you're going to deal with situations. So there are times that I'll go to Marcia and I'll say, I've noticed this about one of our children. I'm not going to say which one. I think you communicate better with her. Why don't you talk to her about it instead of me doing it? Because if I do it, it's more of a challenge to them. And if she does it, it's more of I'm going to call it a friendlier interaction, you know. And so you need to be aware of those kinds of things as well. In terms of parents favoring one or the other, in a lot of families, there's the one child who maybe, let's say, needs help. Just, let's say an adult child who just hasn't gotten traction. And so I think there's a tendency a lot of times on the part of parents to gravitate toward that child and, I'm going to say neglect, that might be too strong a word, but neglect the other ones to the point where they're doing things for this one that help them or maybe enable them. And then it's kind of like, well, kind of like the prodigal son. You know, the father certainly showed favor toward the son who went away, and the other son was like, what are you doing? I've been here the whole time. You know, so you just need to be careful.
I wouldn't say he certainly showed favor. We're going to talk about that next week.
Well, yeah, we are. We're going to talk about the prodigal. But the point is...
To the older son, it looked like he was showing favor. How's that?
Okay. The point is really that you just need to be careful. And you need to show your children, all of your children, the same, I'm going to say the same degree of love and the same degree of attention, even when one is dealing with things that they may need help with. So let me see what else.
And that's a part of, just talk through it. Don't ignore things. You know, things, the elephants in the room or things under the rug really aren't under the rug. So just explain and talk and get it out in the open.
And that teaches your children how to deal with things too. So if you're, you know, one of the things we said was we never had to have the talk with our kids about sex and all that because it was just, we just kind of talked about it. And so it was never this big deal. It just was something we talked about. And I don't mean like we talked about sex all the time. What I'm saying is, we, you know, in the course of life, in the course of the day, when things came up, we just talked about it. And so there really weren't a whole lot of things that we wouldn't talk about. And that made it okay to talk about it when they're adults. So if we see a little rivalry or something going on, we might call them out. And we might say, hey guys, come on, what's going on here? One of the challenges I think that we as parents face is remembering too that in our own lives, we might have situations that seem inconsistent with what we're telling our children. So we might have issues with siblings. So our kids see us telling them, well, you need to get along with your sibling, but they don't see us doing it. And sometimes that happens. You need to talk that through with them too. They need to understand what that context is in that circumstance. So I think you're up.
Okay. Well, now that we're talking about parenting along personality, and we're talking about training, I just want to talk about some broad things that kind of are training, but not that regardless of personality. And the first thing is teaching your children to think. When I was pregnant with Rachel, I was in a firm in New Jersey, and I just remember I was older. We'd been married quite a while before we decided to we thought we should get around to having children. And there was an attorney who was a little older than me, whose kids were just a bit younger than me. And he had 3 children, and they were all just these great kids. And I remember asking him, how do you get your kids to think? Because for some reason, that seemed important to me. And it has always been important to me. If you can get your children to think, it keeps them out of a lot of trouble. If they can just go through a thought process, and you really have to start training them very early so they just get that. And so teach them to think, and you ask questions, analyze, just do all of that stuff. Kelly, our neighbor, told me not too long ago that she was talking to a parent who said their middle-aged girl just really changed when she got to high school. And so she was like, well, why do you think that is? And she said that they told her because she hadn't been trained to think. And so if you can think of, just get in your children's mind and teach them from the time they are born to just ask them questions, think about situations, think about the consequences. So you talk through, okay, if you do this, where does that eventually lead you? And it's just a lot of people don't know how to think. I don't know if that makes sense. But they really just can't go through a process. They just believe whatever anybody tells them. Or they don't think about it, or they just do it, and don't think, oh, maybe I shouldn't do this, or where's this going to lead me, or what are the consequences. So help them to think. Thinking helps them be independent. It helps them to just think through the consequences. We talk a lot in Christian circles about things that are permissible versus beneficial. So sometimes things are permissible, but that doesn't mean they're beneficial. So how do you get to that decision? You think through it. Well, I'm okay to do this as a Christian, but is that really the best thing for me or my family or my witness? Your kids can do the same sort of thought process. You have to think to be discerning versus judging. And then I did a talk a few weeks ago on making decisions, and you also have to think to make decisions. You have to go through a thought process. So just teaching them to think. And I'll probably talk a little bit next week more about asking questions, because that's one of my favorite subjects.
She's a good question asker. With regard to thinking, back to teachable moments, you as a parent want to be observing your kid and take advantage of those teachable moments to cause them to think about what's happening or what's going on. So one of the books, I think She Calls Me Daddy, talks about engaging your children in conversation and making it sort of like a tennis match. So in tennis, you hit the ball to the other player and they hit the ball back. So if you figure questions and answers are that ball, you hit the ball to your son or daughter with a question. So what did you think of the way so-and-so behaved the other day? Well, now they've got to hit the ball back to you and give you an answer. Then you shoot a follow-up question. Then they give you an answer. And so by asking questions, you're causing them to think. Teachable moments. I don't know if I mentioned it in this session or the one we taught before, but when Rachel, I think, was in 8th grade, I had been talking to her about guilt by association. Have I mentioned that here? And we all went to the science fair at Franklin County High School, and one of her friends went with us. And, I'd been talking to her, you got to be careful who you hang out with. You got to be careful who you're seen with, not because of perception, but because when you're with somebody, you're associated with that. So we took her friend with us, or maybe we caught up with her friend there. Anyway, there's all these science projects in the science fair, and the girl has a squirt gun, and she squirts somebody with the squirt gun, and a teacher sees it. Now, Rachel and the girl are together, and the teacher comes over and scolds both of them. Now, Rachel didn't have anything to do with it. Rachel probably didn't even know the girl had a squirt gun, but she was associated with that girl because they were together, and I pulled her aside and said, that's what I'm talking about. So you want to use those kinds of teachable moments to get them, and then the conversation turns to, what do you think about this? How can you avoid that? So you want to always kind of go to the next step. It's very important in their thought process. And one of the things we saw is around 9th grade, their circle of friends started to change. And Marcia will share about that. But the folks they had run with from elementary through middle started to drop off for some reasons.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The next thing is, when you're training them, try to always point out their character. It's not about what they do, it's about who they are. Because they will eventually, just like us, disappoint you or do something wrong with what they do. But if you have instilled in them the benefits of their good character, whether that's kind or loving or thoughtful. So yes, you can sell, if you just look on social media, it's really about what people do. And so think about, how can I build my child up? How can I train them to be who they are, not what they do? And so celebrate who they are. It's good to give them accolades for what they do and what they accomplish, but always work in their character in that, because that's really going to be the most important lasting thing. So always think it's not about it's who they are, not what they do. The other thing is always try to point out truth. And we have talked a lot about it's easy to break trust, but it's hard to rebuild that or get that. So as your child gets older, that's certainly a message and a lesson you need to give them. And I had a Bible study teacher who has 3 younger daughters, and her oldest daughter got her license. And she said, I put the Life 360 app on her phone so I'll know where she is. And I didn't say anything, and I thought, I shouldn't have to depend on an app for my child to tell me where they are. And so that's, again, you train them from early on so that you're not having to know where they are by looking on an app. Yes, we have Find My Friends. We check where everybody is, and apparently they all check where everybody is, but so when truth, I shouldn't have to say, you better not go where you don't have to go because I'm going to find you on an app. They should just say, I'm going so-and-so, and I should be able to trust that they're going so-and-so. And so that's, again, communicate that truth and that trust from the beginning. One other thing that we found as parents is whenever we were telling our girls something they really didn't want to hear, they would say, stop yelling. And I wasn't yelling. I'm not saying I never yelled, but because they hear that. To them, it's a yell because it's something they don't want to hear. So just be aware of that, is sometimes that's getting their feathers ruffled. I guess, stop yelling. It's like, well, it's okay. Another thing, this is a great book. It's Dr. Ross Campbell's How to Really Love Your Child. And we did a parenting study, 20 years ago, that featured him on this videotape. And this book is great, but this concept is great for every relationship, your marriage, and certainly your parenting. And so what it talks about is filling, and you probably have maybe heard this, filling your child's emotional fuel tank, because you're going to drain it at some point. And it's kind of like building up that character. So as you parent, and it's not just to make your children feel like they are, royalty, but to just make them so comfortable with your love, your unconditional love and commitment, that their emotional fuel tanks get filled, and because you're going to have to drain it, because it's like the stop yelling. The minute you say something adverse to them that they think is adverse, they're going to think, Phew. So make sure it's filled so that it doesn't drain out completely and leave them empty. We did this whole different last time because had a week cut out. So
we had it's a 6-week plan. We had to lose a week, so we kind of combined things, and so we're kind of picking up there. Okay, so I want to say this because I do not want this to be lost or misinterpreted. We talk about it's their character, right? Not what they do. We talk about guilt by association. We talk about all these things, knowing their bent. What are they interested in? I want to emphasize this because I don't want it to be lost. We're not talking about it in every single item or every single bullet, but all of this is in the context of our walk as Christians. And so I don't want that to be lost or forgotten or misinterpreted. When we talk about their character, we're talking about building Christian character in them. We don't want them to just be nice people. We don't want them just to be good. We want them to be believers. And we want their lives to exemplify what that is. So when we train them or talk with them or train them up, we want to talk to them about things like their goals. What are your life goals? Now, I was one, I kind of went with the flow, so I never really had a goal. I mean, I never said I want to do this, or I want to achieve this, I want to climb Mount Everest, or whatever. I just kind of went with the flow, and as life, as the river of life went, I would just kind of went along with the flow, and if I ended up over here, it was great. But it's good to have a plan. It's good to have some goals and to talk that through with your kids. So what are their goals? What is their mission in life? As Christians, are they interested in Christian missions? Is that something we should encourage our kids to consider? I think it probably is. What ministries might they be involved in? And how are you able to involve them in the way you, as a couple or as parents, minister in the church or outside the church? So are they involved in the things you're doing to serve? That whole notion of dealing with sin, and how do you address sin in your child's life? Do you come down on them? Do you have a conversation with them? Are you praying for them? What are you as a parent doing to deal with and address the sin in your child's life from a Christian perspective? We know that stealing is wrong, right? But stealing is also a sin. So when we heaven forbid your child should steal, but if your child has stolen something, you have to deal with that, right? how do we deal with it? From the sense that that's just not a good thing to do, or is it because God tells us, thou shalt not steal? So we want to try to put everything in a Christian context. Their lostness or their salvation. You really want to be upfront with them about what does it mean to be saved? How does that affect your life? What direction are they headed? What decisions are they making? Who are they going to marry? So Rachel, for one, had a list by the time she was how old?
In high school.
Sometime in high school, had a list of the characteristics she wanted in a husband. And we didn't know about it. We just kind of found out about it. I guess she mentioned it at some point or something. But she had a list. And well, let me just say it this way. Jake met all of her criteria. Okay? And so somebody who didn't meet her criteria was probably off her list. She just didn't want to deal with it. But you can kind of talk that through with your kids. I don't know that you really need to force them to do something like that, but you want them to be thinking about it. That's why that book, What He Must Be If He Wants to Marry My Daughter, that's on the back table, you can look at it and go buy it. It's a great book, not only for fathers of girls, but for all of us as parents. And even for us as husbands. What should I be? What must I be to lead my family? And I'm first in line to say I fail in so many of those areas. But it's a great wake-up call to us as men, and it's a great tool to use to teach your boys what they must be and to teach your girls what she must be looking for in a husband. So you want to have conversations about that. And then, Bible time, you want to start training them to have a quiet time. We've said many times we've never been successful in having that family devotional time. It just became a big point of frustration for all of us. So we just never really got into a routine of doing that. That doesn't mean you fail as a parent. You have to find those other ways to do it, And then finally, how does God's word apply to their life? I've kind of touched on that a little bit. But in everything, what does God have to say about this? So when you're playing conversational tennis, what does God's word say about it? What do you think why don't you go look that up and come back to me and tell me what God's word says about that? So you can do things like that aren't these big blown up deals, but that teach them. And also that teach them to go to God's word for the answer, which is a great thing for them to do. So, and then I already talked about teachable moments and guilt by association and just taking advantage of those circumstances in everyday life that you can use to have that conversation back and forth to get them to what? To get them to think. Get them to think about how this is going to affect my life, how is this going to affect my spiritual walk, how is this going to affect somebody else. It's not just about them either. It's how their actions affect the other people in their lives, meaning the parents, meaning their siblings, meaning relatives, but also their friends. What spiritual impact is it having? So,
The other thing is, and some of you, your children are already past this, but at some point, probably middle schoolish, you will start seeing the struggle in your kids between childhood and adulthood. And it's so interesting. And, we had girls, we only saw it from a parent of girls' perspective, but literally they could play with dolls one moment and go to a dance the next. And it's so fascinating. There's this struggle. So you've got to kind of be there to help them through that struggle, because children do need a childhood. And it's what we talked about, and we'll talk about it at the end. When they're 16, don't just give them the keys and say, oh, thank goodness. Or like I talked about, get them an Uber account, which is, we'll talk about that again too if you missed that. But so that struggle, they are still children. And so just remember that, and you are still the parent, and they still need, even though they don't want to hear you sometimes, or they'll tell you they're lying, or that they'll tell you you're yelling, they still want that, and they still need that, that struggle. And we did see, Rachel had the same group of friends, literally this huge group of girls from kindergarten on, and we went on an 8th grade chorus trip to Disney World with Mr. Green.
Let me stop you a second. If you have the opportunity to go as a chaperone with your kids, go. If there's a dance and you have the opportunity to chaperone the dance, go. Go.
Yes,
do it.
After that trip,
be enlightening.
Our children never went on a trip again. That we weren't the chaperones, because I always worried about what kids they would room with. I never really worried about the chaperones. After that trip, I worried about the chaperones.
Sorry.
But we saw, so this group of parents and I were chaperones and these 8th grade girls, and we saw this chasm between these two groups of kids. Some of these girls they were just onward and upward, and the rest of had these like little girls still. They didn't need to be onward and upward. They needed to be little girls still. But the culture, I mean, I can't even imagine, that's been many years ago, what the culture now is pushing them to go ahead and be those adults and to do things they just really aren't prepared and mature enough to be. So it's okay to keep your children as young. They need a childhood. Another thing is, and we might get in trouble about this.
Careful.
Well, we've talked about it before, but have you all heard this in this class, that the minute we had Rachel, Armando said, you all know this, I just want to find a way to never have to tell her no. Like,
She keeps bringing this up, you know.
this is going to be a long life together. It's like, really?
I think tomorrow will be the
We've been
40th anniversary of our first, it wasn't really a date, but our first time going out
decided
together.
we like to get each
And she's
other.
still bringing this up.
Well, we've had children for 30 years. But yes, I really want to find a way to never have to tell
Go
her
ahead.
no. But here's the thing, don't make everything a no. And so, and we can talk about, and we don't really have time, but things become enticing if you keep telling them no. So you have got to find a way to balance that and give the right yeses. Because if it's just no, 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 then it's like which tree did Eve want to eat of? The only one she was told she couldn't. And so don't make everything a no, because things do become enticing. Forbidden fruit becomes enticing. And so you've got to be the protector and the guide. So here's like our easy little thing. When Harry Potter came out, I think Rachel was in 4th grade. And I remember our pastor saying, oh, are you letting her read that? And I read them before, I read them with her. And I could have made Harry Potter evil, but I didn't. Because everybody in her class was reading Harry Potter. And so we read it together. After about the 4th book, it became too dark and she wasn't interested anyway. But if I had said, no, you cannot read Harry Potter, she would have wanted to really read Harry Potter. And that's a very simple, and you have to pick your Harry Potter. David Platt in Radical says, sometimes the church is known for everything we don't do. And so there are plenty of things we can do. I think I've said this before. There's like this whole movement about women wanting to be preachers and everything. You know, if women would just do everything we can do, we wouldn't have time to worry about whether we're preachers or not. And so it's the same thing with kids. There's plenty of things to say yes to. So try to say yes to the things you can, but no to the things you can't.
Can I throw something else in there? Let me go back to this whole notion of chaperoning and being involved. It takes time. Sometimes you just don't want to do it. It means riding on a bus all night, sometimes from Frankfort to Disney World or from Frankfort to wherever. And that's the last thing you want to do. But we have seen on trips where that chasm that Marcia was talking about between the kids, I think it might have been on that 8th grade trip. There were girls sitting on boys' laps on the bus.
Well,
And
they had a boys' bus and a girls' bus.
So
I wasn't
what-
going to
what
really
am
go
I-
into this. So we'd stop for the bathroom, and
just
they had
go-
to stop like every 2 hours because it was a charter bus. And there were half the girls would run and get on the boys' bus and on the boys' laps. So we'd have to go pull them off. And so that was the group that had moved onward and upward. I wasn't going to go into that.
that's fine. But the point is simply this. And you also see, you see things at dances, the way they dance. And one story Marcia likes to tell. You want to tell the story about the girl who went to the dance and then went a few years later and was participating?
We've talked a lot about, and we're getting all this mixed up. I don't know if we've said this
It's
or
fine.
not.
It's fine.
But
a lot of this stuff you guys probably know, but some of this we just kind of realized as we were going through life, because nobody gives you a book. I mean, there are books, and so as you're a parent, you kind of see things and you're like, whoa, I never even thought of that. So that's my hope, is that the kinds of things we're sharing with you, it's not earth-shattering stuff, but it's the kind of things that we've experienced as parents that we hope would be helpful to you. So, and that you'd be aware of.
A long
alert to.
time ago, and we were still in New Jersey, we taught a class to teenagers about a seared conscience. I cannot say that. Seared conscience. And so basically, it's you expose yourself to stuff so much that your conscience is seared against it, and it kind of loses its shock value. And so Rachel dated a guy from church, and she was a senior. They were at a homecoming dance. A girl who was a freshman who knew them, had gone to a Christian school before then, came, and she was just mortified because, and Rachel and her date were just sitting outside talking. This was before Mr. Sampson got to Franklin County and changed dances. They're much better than they were, right?
Well, they were. I don't know if they still are.
I don't know if they still are. But so this girl came crying to Rachel. And
At the dance.
At the dance to Rachel and her date, and said, her date wanted to go in and dance. And the dancing was, would be appalling to her.
I think they called it grinding.
She said she was afraid, she didn't want to
bad.
do it, and so she just kind of stayed out with Rachel. By the time that girl was a senior, who was in the middle of the dance floor? She had, her conscience for that kind of dancing was seared because she had just kept being exposed to it. And so that's the kind of thing you have to be careful with is, you all probably we don't notice all the cursing in things anymore because on television, they don't bleep it out anymore. And so you just kind of don't hear things or don't see things or you become callous to them. And so that's the kind of thing, just watch that seared conscience. Make sure, and again, you don't want to be judgmental, you just want to make your children sensitive to things. And again, that thought process.
And you want to know what's going on. As a parent, you just want to know what's going on.
All right, now we're going to talk about real personality. If you go to Luke 2, and we all read Luke 2 at Christmas, and I want to go back, the end of Luke 2 is where Jesus visits the temple when he's 12. But if you go right up before that, Luke 2:36, it talks about Anna. And I just want to read this real quick. There was also a prophetess Anna, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was very old. She had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, and then was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple, but worshiped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child, Jesus, to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. When Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. We talk about praying for your children. That last verse is an awesome prayer to pray for your children. The child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him.
That's Luke 2, verse 40.
But I just want to talk about Anna for a second. She served till she was very old in the temple. But when Jesus came, she recognized him. She knew him. And so I had written a long time ago, Anna could have served God all of her days, yet missed Jesus. So when we talk about giving your kids Jesus, that's what we mean. You can have them check all the boxes. They can attend every youth event. They can attend every Bible school. But if you haven't given them Jesus, if you haven't really told them who Jesus is, what Jesus has done in your life, it doesn't mean anything to them. And at some point, they're just going to stop going through the motions because that's all it is. And so I would just encourage you, when we talk about Jesus, give them Jesus, it's not a box to check because you want them to recognize Jesus when their time comes to recognize Jesus. And so make sure he is real. And I grew up with the sweetest guy. I'll tell you how sweet he was. I had mumps when I was in 3rd grade, and I had this long, messy, curly hair, and so I had fever. My mom put my hair in ponytails. When I went back to school after I had mumps, this kid told me I looked cute. I think I wore ponytails every day for the next 3 years. I mean, it was just sweet guy. But he got the Sunday, and I used to tell this to our teenage girls all the time when we would teach them. He didn't go to my church, but he got the Sunday school pen because I used to give little pins for attending Sunday school, for 12 or 13 years when we were kids. I mean, he never missed class. And when probably we were in our 30s, he and his wife died of Oxycontin overdoses. He missed Jesus. You know, he got a Sunday school pin, but he missed Jesus. And so when we say, give your kids Jesus, make Jesus real to them, make his word real to them. I said before, we have to make Jesus and his word irresistible so that when he comes to them, they want him. Oh, now back to Jesus at the temple. Sorry. So Jesus, they go to the temple. You all know this story. They go to the temple for the feast. They leave. His parents think they are with him. So it even says in verse 44, thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found 3 days. He was lost. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. I mean, that's an Amber Alert situation. It's a 12-year-old boy you can't find for 3 days. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this?" Have you ever said that? Why are you treating me like this? "Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But does that mean he was disobedient before?
In staying at the temple?
Trick question. Was he disobedient when they thought he was disobedient? It's Jesus. No.
He said, I had to be in my father's house.
But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew, so he went back to what I said to pray. He grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. So why do we point that out? Because Jesus didn't fall in line with their expectations. So think about your child. You have goals and expectations, but that doesn't mean if they don't line up with that, they're not being disobedient. You just have to pray and maybe struggle with that, as long as they're in line with God. God has created your child for his purposes, not yours. And that's hard. You know, that's going back to two of our girls doing music and one doing basketball. Anna is really probably my most natural piano player, but she wasn't interested in it. And she still goes, we said they could quit lessons so she would go, if they would just go play. But that wasn't her interest. She liked basketball and now she's doing other things. So again, it's not what I want, it's what the child wants. And they're not cookie cutters, they don't have to be like ours. So when we're talking about, you know, is your child being disobedient? Is your child not falling in line? You've got to keep in mind it's Christ's standards. It's not ours. It's not others. It's not social media's. It's not the world's, because they're going to all change. But Christ's standards are the ones that are going to remain the same. One last really quick thing, and I know I've probably mentioned this before. It's kind of like I heard long ago, if your child is misbehaving in the grocery store and you discipline that child, are you disciplining that child for their benefit or your benefit? So you don't look like you're not paying attention. Even if the child maybe isn't doing anything really wrong. It's just not meeting the standards of the people around. So just remember things like that.
Because you're concerned about the way you look. You know, and then as we talked about this story of Jesus going to the temple and Mary and Joseph losing him for 4 days, I just raise a question. What does that tell you about Mary and Joseph's parenting? They weren't perfect, were they? Right? So that should make us feel better. Let's see. Okay, we're almost done, right? Mm-hmm. So I want to share a couple other things. There's an article. You all can jot down this address. I created a short address for it, so you can look it up on the internet. bit.ly, so bit.ly, bit.ly/prov, P-R-O-V, 226. bit.ly/PROV226. That'll take you to an article that was basically a guy wrote about what does it mean to train up a child in the way he should go. And this article talks about some of the things that I mentioned earlier about whether it's a guarantee or a promise, but he makes a couple really good points in there, and I just want to share these with you. Your children are in your care, and they're looking for your example. They learn how to act by seeing how we act. They're going to learn about the world around them and their role in it from somebody. Somebody's going to teach them. Do you want that to be you, or do you want that to be somebody else out there? Right? Better for it to be you. If they are imitating us and we are imitating God, they will grow up knowing what it means to follow Christ. So we need to lead by example. And what that speaks to is, I'll go way back to the first class, the authenticity of our faith. If they see us saying one thing and doing another, whatever that other thing might be, they're going to see a disconnect, and they're going to question, what difference does their faith make if they're not doing what they tell me it does? Right? What difference is their faith making in their lives? So you really want to be authentic and consistent with your kids, and everything you do, every word you say, every reaction, every rolled eye, every sigh, communicate something to them. So you just need to be careful. It's not to say you're not going to do those things. You just need to be careful about it. And you may want to have conversations with them.
So the differences in our children's personalities, some should be celebrated, some are going to be frustrating, some need adjustment. Most are not wrong or sinful. They're just their personalities. That's who God made them to be. And you need to kind of learn and read and discern. And since we have 3 daughters, we'll just pick on them. We've said Rachel is laid back. She is just putting on her socks before school would take 15 minutes. And it would drive me crazy. But she's still that way. And she's got the sweetest little boy now who's 3, and she is so mild-mannered and so gentle and so unfrustrated when he's 3. That's her personality, and that has played out, and it's been really sweet to see how what used to just be, oh, get your socks on, has turned into this sweet mothering thing. She doesn't get mad at her husband. I mean, she's just happy. Carrie was the drama masks, the happy and the sad. She could do that. She used to watch, we had to forbid her finally from watching Seventh Heaven after school because she would just bawl. She was so into that show, and she's still that way. She is still, would you think she's kind of dramatic, Carrie? She's still very, she teaches music, so she's very, so she has that. She is still, you can read her by her face. Is she happy or sad? Anna is Miss Diligent. So when she was 2, I took them all to pick strawberries. And the other 2, after 12 strawberries, they're off doing something else.
Chasing butterflies or something.
Yeah, Anna is 2, and she picks this entire bucket of strawberries. That's just her. I gave her, how your kids always want to do what you're doing. I started grating this 2-pound block of cheese one time, and she's like, I want to do it. I'm like, oh, just take it and do it. Forgot all about her. Put her at the table with a grater and a bowl. She comes back later, and she has grated this 2-pound block of cheese. That is her. So now she is in a job perfect for her. She's diligent, she completes everything. And so what you might find frustrating is their God-given personality. It's their God-given talent. It's what's made them unique for His purposes. So just remember that. One last little thing, don't label your children. It's kind of like, so I've been on the Avenues for Women board forever, and they do something that's now not called this, but it used to be called theophostic healing. And we used to talk about this when we taught teenage girls. You line 100 people up, and 99 people tell you something positive. What are you going to focus on and remember? The one negative. And so, does anybody else feel that way? I mean, it's like 99 people could give you an accolade, and you're going to worry and fret and think about the one who has said something negative. And so, there's this whole ministry about people who have taken that one lie and just put it into them, and that's who they believe they are. So I never tell a kid they're bad. I never say you're a liar, because those are labels that they don't always stick, but they can stick. You're a cheater, well, maybe they did cheat. That doesn't make them a cheater. Does that make sense? Maybe they did tell a lie, but that doesn't label them as a liar. Those are just training moments to teach them that maybe that wasn't right, but that's not who they are. So always when you're talking about personalities and training your children, you just have to be careful, because we're all going to do those things, and then we just apologize for them and explain them.
And one of the examples Marcia sometimes uses is the brownie or the cupcake. A father saying to his daughter, the daughter is going to get a brownie, and the father says,
Or her second brownie.
Or her second brownie, you don't need that. So she takes that and says, oh, he must think I'm fat, right?
And she's 12, and when she's 40, she's still thinking I'm fat.
Because her dad said something to her that...
That's a real thing that Avenues for Women does a whole ministry on that, because that's just what happens. We believe those lies.
And the fact is, we're all guilty of saying things like that, because it's just what we say. And that father, he didn't mean to say she was fat. He just meant you don't need another brownie.
He didn't say she was fat.
He was just saying you don't need another brownie. It might have been just because of the sugar content. She gets high, whatever. But that's what she holds on to. So you just want to be careful, You all probably think we are like the most overprotective parents in the world. I'll tell you that we are not. We are grateful for the time that we had to invest in our kids. And by God's grace, and I'll say it again, it's an act of God's grace in our lives. All three of them love the Lord and are involved in ministry, and we're just grateful for that. That's our prayer for you too, is that the Lord will bless you with children who love you, but who love Him more. And they may not be in full-time ministry, but who are ministering because they have a commitment to the gospel.
Because they love Jesus.
Right.
That's the bottom line.
Right.